Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on 14th of February of 2023. Today we have some updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with the Kupyansk front line. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 70 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system Gvozdika. But when talking about the situation in the global scope, the Russian sources published a video of large convoys of tanks that Ukrainians were redeploying from Kharkiv and Chuguyev in the vicinity of Kupyansk. So that means that Ukrainians are not planning to step back and they are planning to hold the Kupyansk front line. Furthermore, when talking about the Dvorechna and this area, the Russians reported that there are very heavy clashes in Gryaninkovka. That means that this town is in the gray zone and the Ukrainians have access and have possibility to move more and more reinforcement in this town, just one purpose: to hold the bridgehead in this area, because the Ukrainians understand as soon as the Russians are able to take control over Gryaninkovka, they will change their focus and they will start movement in direction of Kupyansk. So that's why this is still some kind of problem, an issue that the Russians need to solve before starting offensive operation in direction of Kupyansk. The Russians entered the town of Liman and they established their real position, their fortification there. Furthermore, the Russians started movement in direction of Sinkovka, and some Russian sources are saying that they managed to establish control over the north part and over some buildings in this area. For now, there were no video or photo confirmation of that. When talking about the Kupyansk area itself, the Ukrainian source and the Russian sources confirmed that Ukrainians started preparation another fortification line in this area, and they're trying to build fortification along this river and between Kupyansk and Oskol river and let's say Shevchenko. So this is their main defense line that Ukrainians are building these days, start building recently. And I believe that as we discussed a few videos ago, that Ukrainians will be forced and they will take a decision and step back from the north part of Kupyansk, of Kharkiv area, of this area, because as we discussed, it's very difficult to hold these territories. It is very difficult to make rotation process, and there are a lot of Russian commandos and scouts, and I believe that the Ukrainians have losses. And when talking about this part, it is much more easier to protect this area. Railroad is very close to the front line. The Ukrainians will be very flexible with the deploying forces in this area, with moving reserves. They don't need to spend fuel to send reinforcement and manpower to the north. So this is the best front line. The question is whether the Russians are planning to attack and to return back this area. I believe that the Russians will do this. So let's wait and see. Now let's move to the south, to the Liman front line. There are very heavy clashes in the same towns, in the same area. Stelmakhovka, Makeevka, Nevskaya, Terny, Yampolovka, Tarskoye, the forest around Serebryanka. The Russians are pushing all over the front line, but without real progress on the ground. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems, 1 D-30 howitzer and another Grad. As you can see, it's like maybe another month in a row when the losses on Liman front line is the heaviest, and it's stable picture. So that means that there are very heavy clashes in this area, and for now, as we can see, the Ukrainians still are able to control this territory and they're not retreating from this bridgehead. Now let's move to the Seversk front line. As you can see, there were no changes in this area, and we haven't heard and haven't seen any updates from this territory. I believe since the ending of the battle for Soledar, there were few updates about the situation in Bilogorovka, but the situation in Bilogorovka remains. I don't understand the situation in Bilogorovka. If you remember, during this month, on January, some sources were reporting that Ukrainians took a decision to step back, and that Russians were saying that they started evacuation process. But as you can see, the Russian source map hasn't been updated yet. So I believe that this town still remains under Ukrainian control. When talking about Soledar itself, the Russians continue offensive operation in direction of Vasyukovka, Fedorovka, but as you can see, without any progress on the ground. The Russian sources map has been updated, as you can see. Just a small update in the vicinity of Paraskoivka. The Russians added another forest line in this area, showing that they have progress in direction of the road MO3 that connects the north part of Bakhmut with Slaviansk. Let's take a look at the Western sources map. You're gonna see that this map is not updated, but today, this morning, the Russians reported that they managed to cross the road MO3, and furthermore, they managed to establish physical or fire, and some sources are saying that they managed to establish physical control over this intersection, and also these sources added that there are 1,500 soldiers in Paraskovievka, in this town, and this source report that these forces were encircled by the Russians, and there are no possibilities to evacuate from this area, because this road is under fire control, and some sources are saying under physical control, and the south part of Paraskoivka, this territory, is under Russian physical control. But there is still a small road in this area, and I believe that Ukrainians do have possibility to use this road. Later this day, the head of Wagner reported that there are no encirclement of Paraskoivka. Situation is very critical. Situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians, but there are no talks and nothing like encirclement of this territory. So we'll see. When talking about the south of Bakhmut, there are no changes. There are still heavy clashes in the vicinity of Stupachki. The Russians are pushing to the north, trying to establish physical control over the road N32. The Russians attacks in the south of Bakhmut in direction of Ivanovskaya, Bakhmut itself. But as you can see, there are no changes on the ground. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 60 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 5 artillery systems in this area. The Ukrainians lost 4 Stabi howitzer and another Grad, but without any changes on the ground. During the previous 24 hours, the Russian source published attacks, missiles, rocket attacks in town Kramatorsk and town Konstantinovka. I believe that within the next few days, the Russians will provide us information about the warehouses or something like this that they managed to hit during those attacks. Now let's talk about Donetsk, and the most important part. There are two important parts on this front line. Piesky, there are no changes in this area. There are no movements at all. So the Russians, I believe that they did everything they needed. They pushed the Ukrainians from Opitne and Vodyane. Now they established physical and eye control over the north settlements from this area. I'm talking about Severne, Toninka, Lastochkin, and residential area of Avdiivka. And as you can see, today the Russians published a video of attack in some kind of ammo depot in this area, but they didn't provide the numbers and so on, just was information included in the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. If we take a look at Marinka, you're gonna see that this map hasn't been updated a little bit. The Russians added a small block on the south central part of Marinka, that the Russians managed to cross the central road, but also without any progress on the ground. There are still heavy clashes, the Ukrainians moving more and more reserves in this area, and for now I don't see whether the Russians are able to take control over Marinka even by the end of this month, but we'll see. Now let's take a look at Vuhledar. There are still very heavy clashes. You see there are a lot of icons in this area. The Russians published a lot of video and photos of a failed attack in direction of Vuhledar. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 40 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 2 tanks in 2 artillery systems in this area. One Stabi howitzer and another D30 howitzer. But also, as you can see, without any progress on the ground. If you take a look at Zaporizhia area, the Russians reported that during previous 24 hours, they made a very powerful artillery attack in direction of Orekhov and in direction of Malinovka. As a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost their soldiers, had casualties among manpower and so on, but the Russians haven't provided the numbers of those losses. There are very heavy artillery duels on Kherson district. The Russians reported that as a result of previous 24 hours artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost one artillery system Stab B howitzer, and also the Russians managed to destroy at least 2 ammo depot in this area. Very interesting updates are coming from Moldova. As you know, the authorities of Moldova closed the airspace above the territory of Moldova, and they did this as a result of all the panic that goes around this small country. Furthermore, they reported that they spotted the Russian spy air forces in the vicinity of Moldova, so they're very scared. And furthermore, if you remember, a few days ago, the Ukrainians provided information to Moldova authorities that the Russians are planning to make some kind of military coup on the territory of Moldova, and they want to turn back the power in Moldova and to take control according to the Ukrainian sources, of course. And of course, don't forget that during the previous week, the Russians attacked the Snake Island, and furthermore, the Russians attacked with the submarine drone the bridge in Odessa area. So I don't think that the Russians are planning to make some kind of marine operation, or they're doing all these things just because of some kind of preparation of some attack on this part of Odessa. But anyway, everything is possible. Furthermore, today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation provided a very interesting update, very interesting piece of information about upcoming greatest event from the Russian side. If you remember, the Ukrainian authorities announced that on the 24th of February they are planning to make a very big surprise for the Russians, and that Russians will remember this day for ages. It's very difficult to understand what they were talking about, but today the Russian Ministry of Defense provided information that Ukrainians are preparing some kind of provocation, and the main thing that the Ukrainians are planning to provide information about the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They will say, and they're planning to say that the Russians, during the period of time when they were holding this area, they did a lot of things with Chernobyl power plant, and that a lot of nuclear things disappeared from this area, and that Ukraine were polluted with the nuclear things and so on. So this is exactly what they're planning to do. And also the Ukrainians are planning, by using this information, they're planning to force the Ukrainian allies to provide more weapon and so on. Very difficult to understand. And furthermore, by these words that the Russians reported that they're not planning to do any greatest thing within the next few days, maybe the Russians are not planning to start any offensive operation in Ukraine as well. But the Western sources provided a lot of photo from Bryansk region, from Kursk region, and from Voronezh region. They provide a lot of photo of Russian camps with a lot of artillery system, a lot of armored vehicles, with infantry camps and so on. And the Western sources are saying that the same picture we could see before, in the beginning of 2022 on the territory of Belarus and Kursk region, when the Russians were preparing to start offensive operation, this special military operation. So the Western countries are trying to provide some evidence that the Russians are planning to start greatest offensive operation from Bryansk Oblast, from Bryansk region, Kursk region, and Voronezh region. So that means that if it's true, that means that the Russians, according to this information, are planning to start offensive operation in these directions. So the main towns that the Russians, according to these projections, are planning to take to establish control over is Chernihiv, Sumy, and the most important, the Russians, by this attack, will try to cut the railroad that connects Kiev with Donbass and Kiev with Kharkiv. And maybe if the Russians are success, and if they do really plan to do this offensive operation, of course, the main goal is not just to take control over Chernihiv, Sumy, and to cut these railroads. The main thing that the Russians will try to do is to get the Dnipro River, this one, because only there are not, as we discussed, the main benefit, the main thing that the Ukrainians have on this special operation is the railroads and railroad is the bridges over Dnipro and railroad. From one side, this is their positive thing, and from the other hand, this is their negative thing. If the Russians are able to block or cut the bridges, the entire east part of Ukraine will fall within the months, few months, not even less than half a year. So, but when talking about the south part, we discussed that the Russians show their new weapon of submarine drones. So that means that the bridges that located on the south can be taken by those drones. I'm talking about Zaporizhia. I'm talking about Zaporizhia bridges. But when talking about the north, the bridges around Kiev, Kharkiv, and the Cherkasy, these bridges should be blocked by the Russians by their attack from the north. This is the only possible solution for this, because as we saw, the rocket or missile attack against these bridges didn't give the Russians a lot of result. And the main thing that the Russians might try to achieve by attacking from the north is to reduce the number of bridges that Ukrainians are able to use to supply and support Donbass area. They need to block Kiev, Kharkiv, Cherkasy. I don't think that the Russians are able to cut or block Kremenchuk bridges and Dnipro bridges, but when talking about the entire level of supply and support, of course, this north and south attack in direction of Zaporizhia, in direction of, let's say, Dnipro River, will reduce the Ukrainian logistic possibilities. The Russians will be able to focus and concentrate all the Ukrainian supply just through this short area, and of course, they will be able to take care with this using missile and rockets. And anyway, the Ukrainians will have a lot of logistic problems, and sooner or later they will be defeated. So let's see. But when talking about the Ukrainians, don't think that they're not doing anything. The Western sources provide information that the Ukrainians are keeping around 20,000 army just on the northwest part of Ukraine, on the border with Belarus. It's pretty big army, 20,000 soldiers. It's professional, well-trained army with a very short distance to supply and support from Poland. And this is Chernihiv and Sumy region is the only area that the Russians are able to attack these days. It's very hardly unlikely that the Russians will make greatest offensive operation from Lugansk in direction of Kharkiv. It's like the old way, they're old roads, and they're completely fortified without population. Not very good solution with destroyed bridges. The Russians are doing offensive operation on Donbass, and they're stacked, and to move more reinforcements, reserves in this direction won't solve the issue, because it won't solve anything. And to attack from the south, there are also area fortified. We remember that in January, the Russians made an attempt to attack in Guliai-Pole, Orekhov, and Vuhledar, and all their attacks were repulsed. So this is also not a solution. And in Chernihiv and Sumy is the only possible solution for the Russians, just to open another front line and to make an attempt to stretch the Ukrainian army. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.